In this series of videos, we will talk about the Catfish Ridge transition and use this as an introduction for transitions in general. So, what is a transition? A transition is a time when we go from one ridge to another, and we have to kind of traverse a tricky area in between. So when we fly the local ridge, which is the section we see in front of us, it's a nice straight line section of ridge, when we tend to do quite a bit of our early flying, right by the upper reservoir, maybe down to the water gap, and then on over to the saddle underneath us, that little notch that's um, just by that kind of yellow pole. Now, if you want to go further, you have a little bit of a problem, and that is that this section where the ridge extends to is really not flyable. That section forms a box canyon right where Catfish Pond is, where that pole is lined up, right over the Catfish Pond. And a fellow who attempted to fly the high ridge, he ended up going and land basically crashing into the fields at the base of the ridge just behind. So that ridge really doesn't work. It's not a safe place to be. Instead, it is much better to be on the low ridge, on the upwind side, and it requires this making this a little bit of an offset from from the local ridge on over to what we call the Catfish Ridge. And from up high, it doesn't necessarily look like all that much of a ridge, but it's actually a pretty nice ridge. It's just kind of a matter of perspective. And that ridge extends all the way to the power line in the distance, if you can sort of just make out this sliver that's cutting through the terrain. That's the Millbrook power line, and that's the limit of how far our beginners can fly. Now, in making this jump, it's a fairly straightforward, simple jump, but it's quite intimidating in the beginning. There's a couple things we keep in mind. For one, we note the landing options, of course, the field at the base of the ridge, as we've talked about before, but there's also the fields at the base of the Catfish Ridge, which are all pretty landable as well. And so if we are approaching this transition, if we want to head into this area, we have to reassess and kind of make sure that we have these fields in mind if anything goes wrong. And as far as the transition is concerned, make a note down to look at this gully down below. That gully is actually really handy because what happens is that if you have a northwesterly wind, the wind bunches up into that gully. And then when it bunches up, then behind it, it forms a line extending out onto the local ridge. In a sense, where the air kind of gets forced into a little area, then that sucks in all the bubbles and all the thermals in front of it, and that creates a nice energy line. So very often we'll be making our transition from just below over there. But in any case, we'll talk about that more later. The overall points here are just to note kind of kind of get a lay of the land, right? So we have the local ridge, we have the unflyable section right by Catfish Pond, which we don't go into, which requires a transition over to the Catfish Ridge, and we bear in mind the landing options at the base of the ridge.